Welcome back, everyone. In this video, I'm going to give you a quick overview of some leftover tools for evaluating arguments. So in this video, we'll go over inductive standards, we'll talk about necessary and sufficient conditions, and then we'll also talk about some examples as we go through. Well, consider the following argument. My daughter thinks that movie theater popcorn is delicious. And every time I've ever brought her to the movie theater in the past, she's asked me to buy her popcorn. And now this weekend, I'm planning to take my daughter to the movie theater with me. Therefore, my daughter is going to ask me to buy popcorn for her this weekend. Is this argument deductively valid? Well, no, it's not. Even if my daughter thinks that popcorn is delicious and she's asked me to buy it for every time we've been to the movie theater, it's possible that next time we go, she might do something different than she's done in the past. But nonetheless, even though this argument is deductively invalid, it seems like it makes the conclusion reasonable to believe. And this is why we need inductive standards. So remember, there's two kinds of standards. There's deductive standards and inductive standards. Deductive standards are the standards we use when an argument's premises aim to, in some way, guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Inductive standards are evaluative standards we use when the argument's premises aim to, in some way, make the conclusion probably true. This is what happens in that popcorn argument. The premises, the fact that she's asked for popcorn every other time in the past, isn't meant to guarantee that she'll ask next time, but it does seem to give pretty good reason to think that that's at least likely what she would do. Now, there are two central ideas that you need to think of when using inductive standards. The first is strength. So a strong argument is one where it's unlikely that the conclusion would be false while the premises are true. A cogent argument, then, it's an inductive argument that is both strong and it has all true premises. We can talk about some common forms of inductive argument that people often use. One of these forms is called enumerative induction. So this first A is F, the second A is F, the third, the fourth, the fifth. And since all the ones I've seen so far are F, probably the next one, or maybe even all of the A's will be F. Let me give you an example. So the first penguin I saw was black and white. The second penguin I saw was black and white. The third penguin, the fourth penguin, the fifth penguin, etc. The list gets bigger and bigger. Until finally I've seen enough and I conclude, well, probably the next penguin I see, or maybe even all penguins, are black and white. Another common form of inductive argument is argument from analogy. So this argument starts with an analogy. It says A and B are similar. They are analogous in some ways. And then it notices that B, the second thing, has a certain kind of feature. And so it concludes, therefore, A probably has that feature as well, since it's so similar in these other ways. Let me give you an example to make that more concrete. So the car I'm buying is similar to Jane's. Maybe they're the same model, maybe they're both Ford Mustangs, I don't know. Jane's car has been reliable. Thus, probably my car will be reliable too. Another form of our inductive argument is inference to the best explanation. It starts out by noticing some surprising thing that happens. And then we wonder, well, why did it happen? And we come up with various explanations, and we notice that one of these is the best explanation among them. And so we say, since that's the best explanation of why this surprising thing happened, it's probably the true explanation. Let me give you an example. So I noticed that my daughter's robot toy stopped working unexpectedly. And I wonder, well, why could that happen? And I come up with a number of different explanations. And I think to myself, you know what? I think the simplest, maybe most straightforward explanation is just the batteries died. That's the best explanation. So probably the batteries are dead. Another tool that you might need at various times are understanding necessary and sufficient conditions. To say that one thing is necessary for another is to say that you must have it in order to have the other. So you can't have B without A. We can relate this to a specific conditional statement. To say that A is necessary for B is to say that if you don't have A, then you don't have B. Some examples of this. Having four sides is necessary for being a square, because if something doesn't have four sides, then it's not a square. Completing a reflection assignment is necessary for getting an A in this class, because the reflection assignment is worth 15% of your grade. Now, getting at least 90% in this course is not necessary to pass the course. If you don't get at least 90%, well, that doesn't mean you don't pass, because there are other ways to pass. You could pass with a 70%. Now, on the other side, we can talk about sufficient conditions. To say that A is sufficient for B means that A is enough to get B. We can relate this again to a specific condition. When you say that A is sufficient for B, you're saying if A, then B. So let's consider some examples again. Something being a square is sufficient for it being a rectangle because if something's a square, then it's also a rectangle. Getting 95% in this course is sufficient for getting an A in the course because if you get 95% in the course, that means that's enough to get an A. But taking the exams in this class is not sufficient for getting an A because you might take all the exams and fail them. Now, it's important to understand that these necessary and sufficient conditions can come in various combinations because sometimes A will be both necessary and sufficient for another thing. Getting at least 90% in this course is both necessary and sufficient for getting an A. If you don't get at least 90%, then you won't get an A. But also getting at least 90 in the class is enough. It's sufficient. Because that's the threshold. As soon as you get there, you've gotten enough to get an A. Things can be necessary without being sufficient. Being a mammal is necessary, but it's not sufficient for being a human. So, if you're not a mammal, then you are not a human. Being a mammal, though, is not sufficient because being a mammal does not guarantee that you are a human. You could be a different kind of mammal. Sometimes something will be sufficient without being necessary. Living in Tuskegee is sufficient, but not necessary for living in Alabama. If you live in Tuskegee, that's enough to guarantee that you live in Alabama. It's sufficient. But if you don't live in Tuskegee, that doesn't mean you don't live in Alabama. There are other ways to live in Alabama. You can live in Auburn. You can live in Montgomery. You can live in Birmingham. Sometimes a condition might be neither sufficient nor necessary for another thing. As an example, completing all the assignments in this course is neither necessary nor sufficient for passing this class. It's not sufficient because even if you complete all the assignments, yet again, you could fail all of them, but you don't need to complete every single assignment in this course in order to pass. Let's say you miss one discussion post. Well, that doesn't mean you're going to fail the course. If you do other assignments and you do well on them, you could still pass the class. So you don't need to do every single assignment in this course in order to pass. So let's consider this argument again. If Susie studied for the exam, then she got an A. Susie got an A, therefore she studied for the exam. Now notice that premise 1 says that studying is sufficient to get an A. It says if A, then B. It doesn't say that studying is necessary for her getting an A. And that's why even if Susie got an A, it doesn't follow that she studied. Because premise 1 didn't say she needed to study. It just said that's one way for her to get an A. It left open the possibility that she could get an A by cheating or by just knowing the material without studying. That's why this argument is invalid. Now, another reason necessary and sufficient conditions are important is because oftentimes we'll be interested in trying to explain an idea, to give a definition of a concept or word or phrase, and an ideal definition is one that's where everything in your definition is necessary for the thing you're trying to define, and everything taken together, the group of conditions in your definition, is sufficient for the concept you're attempting to define. So imagine someone says, look, a bachelor is an unmarried male. They try to give that definition. Can you think of a counterexample to this kind of definition? I can give you one. Consider my son Malcolm. My son Malcolm is 4 years old, he's unmarried, and he's male. But we don't think of my 4-year-old son as a bachelor. And so this shows that the proposed definition is wrong. The criteria it uses in the definition, being an unmarried male, those are insufficient for actually being a bachelor. And so we can try to fix the definition by figuring out if this isn't enough to make something a bachelor, what can I add to it? And then a natural suggestion that you probably thought of is, well, you shouldn't just say a bachelor is an unmarried male. They also have to be an adult. That's also necessary. But of course, we should also try to think of counterexamples to this definition before we accept it. I'll leave that for you to think about. But now that we have these tools, here's the process that you want to go through when you evaluate arguments. First, you want to identify what the premises and the conclusion are. Then you need to decide which standards are appropriate for that argument. And then you should perform a logical analysis. Look at the logic of the argument. What's the form of the argument? Is it a valid argument or invalid argument? Is it a strong argument or a weak argument? And then you want to perform a factual analysis. Does it actually match the facts? So what reasons are there to believe that the premises are true? What reasons are there to doubt the premises? Can you think of any counterexamples? And you might ask, well, what implications does this argument have? And are the things that follow plausible or implausible? And then one last thing you want to do is look for any informal fallacies. Now, we didn't talk about these informal fallacies in class or in the previous videos, but they were in your reading. And so while we're not going to stress them, I do want you to at least review them and have some small familiarity with them, but they won't be our focus right now. That's all for our crash course in logical tools. Bye-bye.